I'll explain the meaning behind our sermon series shortly, but to start my sermon today, I want to tell you about a story I read this week, a story that came from 1980 from a woman named Rosie Ruiz. She was a completely unknown marathoner. Nobody had heard her name before, and she came out of nowhere and won the Boston Marathon. Spectators didn't even recall seeing her on the course because supposedly she ran so fast. And in the last half mile, people noticed this woman who seemed to come out of nowhere, blazing forward with speed and determination and ultimately winning the race. And in doing so, setting the record for the Boston Marathon in the women's division and becoming the third fastest woman marathoner in the world. You can still look this up on YouTube. People were wondering, where did this woman come from? And they started interviewing her. What does your training look like? Who is your coach? And everybody wanted to know. Everyone was confused how this woman could come out of nowhere and win this race. And as they asked her these questions, she seemed just as confused as they were. She tried to answer them, but it was very clear she didn't have much education when it came to training. She didn't have a coach. She seemed to just run on her own. And this sparked some skepticism from some of the professionals. And so they launched an investigation to figure out, did Rosie actually win this race, or was there something else happening? Well, it didn't take long for them to find out that Rosie had not run the whole marathon. She had taken a shortcut. Just after a mile or two of running the race, she had jumped on the subway, taken the subway all the way to the final half mile, and when nobody was looking, Rosie inserted herself into the race, winning the race and becoming the third fastest woman in the world. Rosie's life was then marked by scam after scam. Attempts to get rich quick or to gain fame or to find love were all met with jail time, broken relationships, and loneliness. And these attempts at shortcuts never seemed to pay out for Rosie. I share that today not because I'm concerned that any of you are attempting to practice fraud in the Boston Marathon, but because, believe it or not, I think we all have something in common with Rosie's story. See, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we all like shortcuts. We all like convenience, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we like to take the shortest route to work. I mean, we find the shortcuts to avoid traffic. We like to find the most efficient ways to do work, or more efficient ways to get our kids down to bed, even if it means taking a couple shortcuts like a little bit of melatonin. What I'm saying is, shortcuts aren't always inherently bad, but then there's some shortcuts that we're not so proud of. There's those shortcuts in our lives where we do them and we know, I probably shouldn't have dipped my toes in that water. It's taking that shortcut at work to get the job done quicker, but not necessarily doing the job well, or telling little white lies in your relationship just to keep the other person happy, seeking quick hits of dopamine and a false sense of intimacy by looking at things that you shouldn't look at. See, whether we want to admit it or not, we love shortcuts. And some of those shortcuts cause us to sacrifice our values and our integrity for a quick moment of peace. We're in a sermon series right now called Don't Eat the Donuts. And we're going to be looking at, over the next 4 or 5 weeks, the life of Joseph throughout the Old Testament. And you might be thinking, what do donuts, Joseph, and this topic of shortcuts and integrity all have in common? Certainly Joseph wasn't struggling with eating donuts during the Old Testament. There's no mention of donuts. But the reason why I thought we could launch into a series like this is because as we look at the new year, many of us are making resolutions. If you're anything like me, you're surrounded by temptation everywhere you go in the form of sweets. There's bins of cookies and random places in our house, and I'm constantly tempted to eat cookies. And maybe you've been in a perpetual sugar coma for the past few weeks, and you haven't been to the gym in a while, and so you're making these resolutions like I am. Because here's my problem. When I start eating sweets, I can't stop eating sweets. We have this bag of donuts, or had a bag of donuts on our counter at our house, and it kind of represents this whole struggle for me. These donuts are amazing. They just melt in your mouth. They're sugary goodness, and they represent my desire to simultaneously better myself and get healthy, but the constant temptation to indulge in some sugary goodness. Like, I want to just take that shortcut and get that hit of sugar and dopamine rush that comes from eating these sweets. And sometimes when I struggle with eating sweets, I think of it like the Apostle Paul, who he said this in Romans. He said, "I don't understand what I do, for what I want to do, I don't do, but what I hate, I do." Is it just me, or are we all on the same page with that? I don't want to eat the donuts. I know they're bad for me, but then I eat the donuts. I settle for a brief escape into sugary, calorie-dense goodness at the expense of my long-term plans for health. And while Joseph didn't have a struggle with eating donuts, as we're going to see, he was surrounded by temptation in a foreign culture. Temptations that encouraged him to take shortcuts and sacrifice his integrity or his values. Sometimes it was in the form of lying, sometimes in the form of seeking revenge, sometimes it was in the form of trampling over someone else. And yet, despite the overwhelming temptation that Joseph faced, he chose to not eat the proverbial donuts, to not indulge in temptation, and to live a life of integrity in the face of overwhelming temptation. And I can't think of a more fitting series as we start off the new year. Joseph's story is fascinating. He's born to Jacob and Rachel. He's the 12th son out of 13 kids. I have 4 kids right now, and it's chaotic. I can't imagine having 13 kids. And this was the type of big family that they should make a reality TV show about, you know? Like they were nomads in the Middle East. They're trying to find their way and get settled. And there's all this drama that's happening that would make for great television. You've got Jacob, who is older in age, and he's married to Leah and Rachel is his favorite wife. And Rachel gives birth in his old age to Joseph, the youngest son. And Joseph quickly becomes the golden child. And maybe you've heard this story before. Jacob gifts his son, and only his son Joseph, a coat of many colors. That's significant because it says a lot. Number one, he's giving a gift to just Joseph, nobody else. This isn't like Joseph's birthday present. This is just, hey, I thought of you today, Joseph. Here's an expensive gift that I want to impart to you. And being such an ornate, designed, colorful coat, it communicated something to his other siblings, to his brothers. See, it'd be a lot like Pastor Hannah gifting me a suit. Like, the suit would be nice. I'd wear it when I came to work, but I wouldn't wear it when I was out working in my yard. I wouldn't wear it while I was mowing the lawn or shoveling the driveway. See, what he's communicating in this moment is the fact that Joseph has the privilege and the pleasure of living this plush life, of kicking back at home with his feet up, enjoying all the resources that his father has to offer, while all the other boys have to work in the dirty, smelly fields with sheep. Joseph truly is the golden child. And his brothers, they begin to become bitter at Joseph. And Joseph is a bit naive. He's young, maybe a bit ignorant. And so he kind of only makes things worse for him in chapter 37. As a golden child, he has a dream. And it says this in Genesis 37, chapter 5. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field," clearly something he probably didn't do because he was wearing his coat of many colors. "We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly a sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." And his brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he said. And then he had another dream. He doesn't learn the lesson. And he told them this dream. He said, "Brothers, listen, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." And when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So not a tactful moment or a wise decision on Joseph's part. I mean, his brothers already don't like him, and now he's saying, "Hey, guess what, guys? At some point, you're going to bow down to me. I'm going to be the ruler over all of you." And the brothers are furious. They're brooding, and they decide to eat the proverbial donut, to fix their problems real quick. It says this in verse 17. Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in a distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." So a quick fix. This will solve all of our problems with Joseph. Reuben, maybe one of the wiser of the brothers, talks him off the ledge slightly, and instead of killing Joseph, they throw him into a pit. They sell him into slavery. Jacob thinks that his golden child is dead and gone and is devastated. And Joseph begins to spend his life in a foreign land. He's made a slave in the house of an Egyptian officer named Potiphar. And what's really amazing as we journey into chapter 38 and 39 is that in spite of the pit that he finds himself in spite of the life that he had that it just fell apart around him, I mean, Joseph has every right to be bitter. He has every right to be angry, to not work hard, to just kind of drag his feet. But Joseph takes a different approach. In this foreign land, in the pit of life, he chooses to work hard, live with integrity, and love God through it all. This is the key chapter I want to focus on, chapter 39. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. And this pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. And from the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. So life is as good as it can get, given the circumstances for Joseph. Yes, he's been sold into slavery. Yes, he's far away from his family, but God has never left his side. God has been with him through the whole process. He experiences success, and it's almost, Joseph has like these natural abilities combined with God's blessing that enable him to prosper. And right when things are going well, right when everything is moving in the right direction for Joseph, it says this in chapter 39, verse 6. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and sleep with me," she demanded. But Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He's held back nothing from me except you because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. One day, however, no one else was around when he went in to do his work, and she came and grabbed him by the cloak, demanding, "Come on, sleep with me." And Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. And when she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make a fool of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed, and when he heard my scream, he ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind with me." And she kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. And you can imagine just the anger that this man felt on behalf of his wife. Potiphar was furious, it says in verse 19. So he took Joseph, threw him into prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. Over the next few weeks, we're going to continue the story of Joseph, but I want to stop there because there's a few points throughout this lengthy bit of scripture that really stand out to me. And I'd encourage you, actually, this is such a dense passage. There's so much that we could pull apart out of this. Go back and read through chapters 37 through 39 this week. But there's three things that stood out to me this week as I was studying this passage. The first thing I don't want us to miss is verse 9. In the face of temptation, Joseph says this, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" See, Joseph is able to live with integrity, to live a life that models what it means to be a follower of God. How was he able to accomplish this with so much temptation in a foreign land when his life was, by all accounts, falling apart? Well, the first way he was able to do it was Joseph decided ahead of time that his relationship with God was worth more than any fleeting pleasure. Here's a principle that's important for us to understand. You don't decide your values in the moment, you decide them in advance. You don't decide your values in the moment, you decide them in advance. We can say it like this: we're not reactive, we're proactive. We're proactive with our values. We know our values before the test comes. We can think of it like this. We have some students here in the room right now. And for those of you who are far removed from high school and you don't remember what it's like to take a test, just try to put yourself back in those shoes. But imagine, for the youth here today, imagine you go to school on the first day and they say, hey, at the end of the school year, you're going to take a test. This test is going to be on everything that you've learned over the past year. And if you pass this test, you'll graduate to the next grade. But if you don't pass this test, if you don't understand the material, if you don't show that you're able to properly understand these problems, you're going to start all over again. And then imagine, and not that any of our youth would do this, not that any of us would do this, imagine you didn't study. You just sat there and you played your Nintendo Switch, and then you were supposed to go to class, but you had better things to do. You decided, I'm going to go to the movies instead. And you got to the end of that year, and you had this big test, and you looked at it, and it was like reading a foreign language. You hadn't done any of the studying, any of the preparation, and now you had a test in front of you that you were going to fail. That's what's called being reactive. Being proactive is studying, is showing up, is knowing the material. And when it comes to our faith, when it comes to our integrity and our values, we must be proactive instead of reactive. We already know the answer when that person hands us that drink. We already know the answer when he or she wants to push the boundaries in dating. We already know the answers when someone at work asks us to fudge the numbers just a little bit to make the company look better. We know our values before the test comes. And being proactive with our values allows us to do step 2, which is what Joseph does, set boundaries in advance that protect our integrity. So first, Joseph knows his values in advance. He knows what it means to follow God, and he decides he's going to adhere to those values. The second thing he does is he sets boundaries to protect his integrity. Look at this in verse 10. It says, Potiphar's wife spoke to Joseph day after day, and he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Explains that he also went out of his way to avoid her at all costs. Joseph avoided putting himself in situations that could lead to compromise. And here's a reality for many of us today. We may have an idea of what's right and wrong. We may have an idea of what we should or shouldn't do, but many of us, if we're honest, we lack the boundaries to protect our integrity. Case in point, I don't have it on me right now. Go ahead and reach in your pocket and pull out that iPhone you have or that smart device. Every one of us has one of these. And the reality is for many of us, we don't have the proper boundaries in place to protect our integrity. I remember one pastor telling this story. He had a 5-year-old son, and he would give his phone to his 5-year-old son, and his son would get on there, and he'd be playing games, and his son was playing this one game, and he was getting really, really good at it. He was getting all these achievements. He was actually like progressing in the game that was abnormal for a 5-year-old, and he wondered, like, man, my kid must be really gifted with video games. I don't know what's happening here. He found out what was happening when he received his credit card bill that month. His 5-year-old didn't have any boundaries, no password protection, and so his 5-year-old was in the iPhone purchasing $200 worth of things that could help him advance in the game. He paid the price for not setting boundaries on his phone. And I'm not telling anybody how to parent here right now, but here's what I know is that one of the easiest things to do, especially as a parent, is pass off that phone or give them that tablet. And what I see so often is and I get it, because it's like you can be at a restaurant and you can have your kids like going crazy. You give them an iPad and it's like they narc out. They're quiet immediately. It is peace. It is nice. You can have a conversation with your spouse all of a sudden. But don't sacrifice your family's integrity for a moment of brief peace. Don't sacrifice your values for a moment of brief peace. Listen, I'm not telling you your kids can't have an iPad or they can't have an iPhone. What I'm saying is if you don't have the right boundaries in place, they may know what's right and wrong. Maybe you're good and proactive at that conversation, but if there are no boundaries in place, it's only a matter of time before they stumble across something that they shouldn't be looking at. I mean, this is not just a concept when it comes to technology. We need to set boundaries to protect our integrity. We need to set boundaries when it comes to who we spend time with, the things we digest, the media we watch. We need to set boundaries that protect our integrity. Joseph did this so well. He knew his values before the test came. He set his boundaries to protect his integrity. And then what we see in Joseph's life is he learned to trust God with the outcome. Because how many of you know that sometimes when you choose to establish your values, sometimes when you set boundaries, it leads to disappointment from other people? You have to say no to that family member or that friend. And if anyone's a people pleaser like me, that's the last thing that you want to do. And Joseph, he faced consequences for his integrity. He faced consequences that landed him in prison, but he was unwilling to sacrifice his integrity for short-term, fleeting peace. It says that in spite of where he was, in slavery and in the prison, the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him throughout that whole process. Listen, integrity may cost you in the short term, but God's favor and purpose are worth it. It may cost you in the short term, but his purpose and his favor are worth it. Remain faithful even when integrity feels like it's costing you. Trust God to honor your obedience. It might be hard to say no to him or her. It might be temporarily disappointing, but what you might experience, but it is far more worth it to experience the favor and the purpose of God that come when you walk with integrity. That you walk with holiness, when you seek to live and love like Jesus in every area of your life. It may be hard to get rid of technology for your kids. It may be hard, but temporary inconvenience that you experience is is much more worth it when you think of the favor and purpose that come from God when you walk with integrity. I can't think of a person who really modeled this better than Billy Graham, famous evangelical preacher. And, in an age where we see more and more pastors or spiritual leaders failing and making moral mistakes and falling, Billy Graham is one of those people that finished well. Billy Graham, there's this famous rule that has been taken out of context called the Billy Graham rule. And it was rules that Billy Graham lived by. And, it's interesting because some people like to just focus on one of those rules, but it was actually this broad set of rules that Billy Graham lived by. And he created these rules for his life while he looked around and he saw all of his peers falling and failing. He saw so many prominent pastors, so many prominent evangelical leaders who were having moral failure. And he said, I don't want that to be my story. I want to finish well. And so he created these rules for which he lived by. The first rule that Billy Graham set for himself was that he was going to live on a set income. And this was really significant given what his job was and what the model at the time was for these evangelical crusades. A typical crusader would go out and they would have these big events. They'd fill stadiums and they'd tell people about Jesus and people would come to know Jesus. And then they'd say, and if you want to see this keep happening, you should give to our foundation. He saw all of these pastors compromising their morals and building wealth for themselves. And he saw how all of a sudden these events, they weren't fully altruistic. Some of these events, he worried, were more about filling the pastor's pocket than reaching people with Christ. And so he went to his board and he said, we're not going to make money off of these crusades. I'm going to make a meager income, a meager living for the rest of my life. If we decide to raise it up a little bit, that's up to you as a board to decide. But we will not use these crusades to put money in our pockets. That's the first rule of life Billy Graham had. He decided his values and he set boundaries in advance. And he trusted God with the process. The second thing he did was he saw all these pastors who were experiencing sexual immorality, who were going out and having affairs and making these huge, devastating mistakes. And he said, okay, well, we're not going to put ourselves as a leadership team in any compromising situation. So we're not going to put ourselves alone in another room with a member of the opposite sex. We're going to draw these boundaries and we're going to adhere to them and we're going to stick by them. The third thing that he did is he said, we're always going to build up the church. So this isn't about building up our organization. This isn't about building up what we do. No, this is about building up the local church. And so every time they would come into a town, tell people about Jesus, they would build systems and put things in place to send people back to the local church and to empower the local church. And lastly, in an age when pastors were fudging their numbers, talking about the millions of people that they reached, Billy Graham determined we're going to have integrity with our publicity. If we have an event and nobody shows up, we will report the numbers accurately. If we have an event and maybe people don't make a decision to follow Jesus, that's okay. We're going to report those numbers accurately. We're not going to be dishonest with the way we operate in this ministry. Billy Graham decided his values in advance. He set boundaries for his life, and then he trusted God with the process. And to date, it's estimated that Billy Graham Crusades, his organization as a whole, saw 3.2 million people come to know Jesus. I wonder what God can do through you. I wonder if we were to determine our values, set boundaries in place that cause us to live and love like Jesus in the year 2025, what God could do in you and through you. The people that God would lead you to reach. The people that God would put in your pathway who need to see somebody who actually lives and loves like Jesus, who models the values of Christianity in a way that is completely countercultural. See, at City Hope, we're passionate about not being a come and see church. We're passionate about being a go and be church. I heard a pastor talk about it like this. There's lake churches and then there's river churches. Lake churches are all about accruing. Come and see what we're doing. And lakes aren't inherently bad. They provide nourishment and they create an ecosystem. But river churches, they go. They carve paths through barren wastelands. They bring life to places that need it desperately, and that's who we need to become. But in order to become that as a church body, in order to bring life, in order to embody the values of Christ, we must first protect our integrity. One of the greatest gifts that you can give your family, one of the greatest gifts you can give your church, is truly living and loving like Jesus. Living with integrity, protecting your values, and setting those boundaries in advance. See, I recognize that there are people here today who you're thinking of those boundaries that maybe have been lacking in your life right now. You're thinking of those values that maybe this year you just kind of slipped on, you compromised a little bit. And if that's you, I want you to know it's not too late. God can do a restorative work in you and through you. He can transform you from the inside out. And so as we go into this new song, I just encourage you to bring those boundaries, bring those values that maybe you've fell short on, bring them to God. Ask for forgiveness and ask Him to rebuild something new in your life. Ask Him to make 2025 the year where you truly seek to live with integrity and to live and love like Jesus in such a way that it transforms the people around you. Let me pray for us. God, we recognize that we're here today, and man, there have been a lot of positive things that have happened this year, but we also recognize that there are areas of our lives where maybe our values aren't in alignment with you, or our boundaries have kind of been lacking, or there's holes in our armor. And Lord, I pray that you would begin to build those walls back into place, that we would put boundaries and hedges of protection around ourselves and around our families, that enable us to live and love like you. And that as we do that, as you transform our hearts and our minds, that would launch us into our community to make a difference everywhere we go. I pray that people would look at our lives and see people marked with holiness. People who seek to live and love like Jesus everywhere we go. And I pray that in that process, you would help other people to find and follow you. Lord, use our story for your glory. And Lord, I pray this all in your holy and sovereign name. Amen.